They told her to stay in her place, to stop wasting time on something that didn't matter. But when a simple act of kindness led to the most unexpected twist, everyone was left speechless. This is a story about kindness, cruelty, and how one small action can ripple into something extraordinary. Samantha was only 24 years old, but she'd already seen her fair share of struggles. Working as a waitress in a small, sleepy town wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills barely. She lived in a modest apartment with peeling wallpaper and a creaky bed frame, constantly budgeting every dollar to make ends meet. Her days were long and exhausting, often spent running back and forth between tables, balancing trays of hot coffee and greasy diner specials while listening to customers complain about the most trivial things. But Samantha wasn't the type to complain. She had dreams, big ones. She wanted to open her own little cafe someday, a place filled with warmth and light, where people could come not just for food but for comfort. She even had a journal where she sketched out ideas, scribbling down potential menu items and designing layouts for the cozy space she imagined. Yet, with her current paycheck, that dream felt like a distant star, beautiful but unreachable. The diner where she worked was nothing special. It was the kind of place where locals came out of habit, not excitement. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, and the smell of stale grease lingered in the air no matter how often the floors were mopped. Her boss, Mr. Edwards, was a gruff man in his late 50s with a permanent scowl etched into his face. He was the kind of manager who believed in rules over reason and profits over people. To him, everything was about efficiency. No wasted food, no wasted time, and certainly no wasted compassion. Samantha had learned to stay out of his way. She did her job, smiled at the customers, and kept her head down. But that all changed one cold, gray afternoon in early November. The town was already bracing for winter, and a bitter chill hung in the air. Samantha was on her lunch break, sitting on an overturned milk crate behind the diner, nibbling on a sandwich she'd brought from home. That's when she saw it. A stray dog huddled near the dumpster. The dog was small and skinny, its ribs pressing against its thin, dirty coat. Its fur was a patchwork of tangles and dirt, and its eyes, oh, its eyes, they were filled with a haunting mixture of hope and despair. It didn't make a sound, didn't bark or whimper. It just sat there, staring at her with those big, soulful eyes, as if it was silently begging for help. Samantha's heart clenched. She'd always had a soft spot for animals, ever since she was a little girl. Growing up, her family couldn't afford pets, but she'd always dreamed of having a dog, a loyal companion who would greet her with wagging tail and unconditional love. Seeing this poor creature in such a pitiful state brought tears to her eyes. But she hesitated. Mr. Edwards' voice echoed in her mind. No feeding strays. We're running a business, not a charity. She knew he meant it. He'd fired a dishwasher last year for sneaking leftovers to a homeless man who came by asking for food. Samantha couldn't afford to lose this job. It was her lifeline, her only source of income. Still, she couldn't shake the image of the dog from her mind. It was shivering, its bony frame barely able to withstand the cold. She thought about what it must have gone through, wandering the streets, scrounging for scraps, dodging cars and harsh words from strangers. How many people had walked past it, ignoring its silent plea for help? As her break came to an end, Samantha made a decision. She couldn't just leave the dog there. She went back inside the diner and carefully wrapped up a piece of leftover chicken from a plate that a customer hadn't finished. It wasn't much, but it was something. Her hands trembled as she carried the food outside. The dog perked up, its ears twitching as it caught the scent of the chicken. Samantha crouched down a few feet away, holding out the food. "Hey, buddy," she whispered, her voice soft and soothing. "It's okay. I won't hurt you." At first, the dog hesitated. It took a cautious step forward, then another, its tail tucked between its legs. Samantha stayed still, letting the dog come to her. Finally, it snatched the chicken from her hand and devoured it in seconds, its eyes darting around as if expecting someone to take it away. Samantha smiled, feeling a warmth in her chest despite the cold. For a brief moment, she forgot about her worries, about Mr. Edwards and the looming threat of his wrath. In that moment, it was just her and the dog, two souls finding solace in each other. But the moment didn't last. As Samantha stood up to go back inside, she heard the unmistakable sound of the kitchen door slamming open. She turned to see Mr. Edwards storming out, his face twisted with anger. "What do you think you're doing?" he barked, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. Samantha froze, her heart pounding in her chest. He looked so hungry. I just thought, I don't pay you to think. Mr. Edwards snapped, his face growing redder by the second. "How many times have I told you? No feeding strays. You're encouraging them to hang around, and that's bad for business." "But he's just a dog," Samantha protested, her voice shaking. "He's starving. I couldn't just—" "I don't care," Mr. Edwards interrupted, his voice booming. "If you can't follow the rules, then you don't belong here. You're fired. Get out." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. "Fired? Just like that?" Samantha felt a lump rise in her throat, but she refused to cry in front of him. She nodded stiffly, untying her apron and handing it over before walking back inside to gather her things. As she packed up her belongings, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. She was jobless. Rent was due in 2 weeks, and she had no savings to fall back on. How would she survive? But as she stepped outside, carrying the weight of her shattered world on her shoulders, she saw the dog again. It was sitting by the parking lot, its tail wagging gently, as if sensing her pain. Samantha knelt down and buried her face in her hands, letting the tears she'd held back finally spill out. The dog nudged her arm with its nose, and Samantha looked up. Its eyes, so full of gratitude, seemed to say, "Thank you." In that moment, she realized something important. She might have lost her job, but she hadn't lost her humanity. She'd done the right thing, and she would do it again in a heartbeat. Without a second thought, she opened her car door and patted the seat. "Come on, buddy," she said, her voice still thick with emotion. The dog hesitated for a moment before jumping in, curling up on the passenger seat, as if it had always belonged there. Samantha didn't know what the future held, but as she drove away from the diner, she felt a strange sense of peace. She had nothing to her name but a stray dog and a heart full of hope, and for now, that was enough. Samantha couldn't shake the image of the stray dog. Its thin body and sorrowful eyes burned into her memory. She had seen many stray animals around town before, but something about this dog felt different. Maybe it was the way it sat quietly, as if it had given up on expecting kindness from the world, or maybe it was the silent resilience in its gaze. Whatever it was, Samantha knew she couldn't just walk away and pretend it didn't exist. As the lunch rush dwindled and the diner grew quieter, Samantha found a moment to slip into the kitchen. She glanced around to make sure Mr. Edwards wasn't nearby, then quickly wrapped up some leftover roast chicken from a plate that a customer hadn't finished. Her hands moved swiftly, almost instinctively, but her heart pounded as if she were doing something forbidden, which, technically, she was. With the chicken in hand, Samantha stepped out the back door and into the crisp afternoon air. The dog was still there, sitting by the dumpster, its head resting on its paws. The sight made her chest tighten. "Hey there," she called softly, crouching a few feet away. The dog's ears perked up at the sound of her voice, but it didn't move. Samantha tore off a small piece of chicken and held it out. "It's okay," she said, her voice as gentle as she could make it. "I won't hurt you." At first, the dog stayed where it was, its body tense and its eyes filled with suspicion. Samantha stayed still, giving it time. She knew trust wasn't something that came easily, not for dogs, and not for people either. Slowly, the dog inched closer, its nose twitching as it caught the scent of the food. "That's it," Samantha murmured, a small smile tugging at her lips. "You're okay. You're safe." Finally, the dog took the chicken from her hand, its movements quick and cautious. As it ate, Samantha felt an unexpected wave of happiness wash over her. It was a small thing, just a bit of leftover food, but in that moment, it felt like the most important thing she'd done all day. But her moment of quiet triumph was short-lived. As Samantha stood up, brushing off her knees, she heard the creak of the kitchen door behind her. Her stomach dropped. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" She turned to see Mr. Edwards standing in the doorway, his face a mask of fury. He stepped outside, letting the door slam shut behind him. "I was just—" Samantha began, but he cut her off. "Don't even try to explain," he snapped, his voice rising. "I've told you before, no feeding those pests. They'll keep coming back, and then we'll have a whole pack of them hanging around, scaring off customers. Is that what you want?" "It's just one dog," Samantha protested, her voice trembling. "It's starving. I couldn't just—" "I don't care," Mr. Edwards barked, his face growing redder with each word. "This is my diner and my rules. If you can't follow them, then you can find work somewhere else." Samantha felt a lump rise in her throat. "You're firing me over this?" "You're damn right I am," he said, crossing his arms. "I don't need someone who can't respect my authority. Pack your things and get out." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She stared at him, hoping he might change his mind, but his expression remained cold and unyielding. Swallowing hard, Samantha nodded. "Fine," she said quietly. "I'll go." Inside, she gathered her things in a daze, her hands shaking as she untied her apron and stuffed it into her bag. She tried to ignore the curious stares of the other staff and customers, but her cheeks burned with humiliation. As she stepped outside, the late afternoon sun seemed cruelly bright, mocking her pain. She stood in the parking lot for a moment, clutching her bag and trying to figure out what to do next. She felt lost, like a ship adrift in a storm with no compass to guide her. Then she saw it, the dog, sitting near the edge of the lot, its tail wagging gently, as if sensing her despair. A fresh wave of tears welled up in Samantha's eyes, but this time, they weren't just tears of sadness. They were tears of gratitude. In a strange way, the dog's presence felt like a lifeline, a reminder that she wasn't completely alone. She crouched down, setting her bag on the ground, and held out her hand. "Come here, boy," she said softly. The dog hesitated for a moment, then trotted over, its tail wagging faster now. Samantha reached out to pet it, and it nuzzled her hand with its cold, wet nose. "You're a good boy," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You didn't deserve to be treated like that." She glanced at her car, then back at the dog. "Do you want to come with me?" she asked, as if it could understand her. The dog tilted its head, its eyes shining with what she could only describe as hope. Samantha stood up and opened the passenger door. "Come on," she said, patting the seat. The dog hesitated for only a moment before jumping in, curling up on the seat, as if it had always belonged there. Samantha smiled through her tears and got behind the wheel. As she drove away from the diner, a mix of emotions swirled inside her: anger at Mr. Edwards, fear of what the future held, but also a deep, unexpected sense of peace. She had nothing to her name now, no job, no clear plan, but she had this dog, and somehow, that felt like enough. The drive home was quiet, save for the soft hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of the dog shifting on the seat. Samantha glanced over at it, her heart swelling with affection. "I think I'll call you Lucky," she said with a small smile. The dog's tail thumped against the seat in response, and Samantha laughed, a real, genuine laugh that felt like a balm for her weary soul. When they arrived at her apartment, Samantha carried Lucky inside and made him a makeshift bed out of an old blanket. She didn't have much to offer, but she was determined to give him the best life she could. As she watched him settle into his new home, Samantha felt a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid. She had lost her job, but she had gained something far more valuable: a loyal friend and a renewed sense of hope. Little did she know, this was only the beginning of a journey that would change both their lives forever. Samantha's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as she drove home, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. Lucky, the stray dog she'd just taken in, was curled up on the passenger seat, his soft snores filling the otherwise quiet car. It wasn't the life-changing moment she'd envisioned for herself, but something about having Lucky there made the crushing weight of losing her job a little easier to bear. Her phone buzzed on the seat beside her, interrupting her thoughts. Samantha frowned, glancing at the screen. The number was unfamiliar, and for a moment, she debated whether to answer. Most unknown calls were spam or wrong numbers, and she wasn't in the mood for either. But something, perhaps intuition, urged her to pick up. She swiped to answer, her voice cautious. "Hello." "Hi, is this Samantha?" the voice on the other end asked, deep and slightly breathless, as though the person had been running. "Yes, this is Samantha," she replied, her brow furrowing. "Who's this?" "My name is Jacob," the man said, his tone tinged with urgency. "I think you just saved my dog." Samantha blinked in confusion, her grip on the steering wheel tightening. "I'm sorry, your dog?" "Yes," Jacob said, his voice rising with a mix of excitement and disbelief. "I saw someone feeding a stray behind the diner earlier today. A friend of mine texted me about it, and they mentioned the dog looked a lot like mine, Max. He's been missing for weeks." Her heart skipped a beat. "You think Lucky is your dog?" "Lucky," Jacob echoed, and Samantha could almost hear the smile in his voice. "I've been calling him Max. He ran away after a thunderstorm a few weeks ago. He's my best friend. I've been searching everywhere for him, flyers, social media posts, everything. Please, can you describe him? Or better yet, send me a picture." Samantha pulled over to the side of the road, her hands trembling. Could this really be happening? She glanced at Lucky, who had now lifted his head, his ears perking up as though sensing her sudden shift in mood. Taking a deep breath, she snapped a quick photo and sent it to the number. A moment later, the phone buzzed again. Jacob's voice cracked as he spoke. "That's him. That's Max. Oh my God, I can't believe it. It's really him." Samantha stared at Lucky, her heart pounding. "He was just sitting by the dumpster behind the diner," she said quietly. "I didn't know." "Please," Jacob interrupted, his voice urgent. "Can we meet? I need to see him. You have no idea what this means to me." Samantha hesitated. Part of her didn't want to let Lucky go. In the short time they'd spent together, she'd already started to feel a connection. But hearing the raw emotion in Jacob's voice made her realize this wasn't about her. This was about doing the right thing for Lucky and for Jacob. "Okay," she said finally. "Where do you want to meet?" They agreed to meet at a park not far from Samantha's apartment. The sun was beginning to set by the time she arrived, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. She parked her car and glanced over at Lucky, who was now sitting upright, his tail wagging slightly, as though he knew something important was about to happen. Jacob was already there, pacing near a bench with a flyer in his hand. He looked to be in his late 30s, his hair slightly disheveled and his face etched with worry. As Samantha stepped out of the car, holding Lucky's makeshift leash, Jacob's eyes widened. "Max," he called, his voice cracking. Lucky froze for a moment, his ears twitching. Then, as if recognizing the voice, he bolted forward, dragging Samantha along with him. Jacob dropped the flyer and fell to his knees, his arms outstretched. "Max," he cried, tears streaming down his face. The reunion was nothing short of magical. Lucky, or Max, jumped into Jacob's arms, licking his face and whining in excitement. Jacob buried his face in the dog's fur, his shoulders shaking as he sobbed. "I thought I'd lost you," he whispered. "I thought you were gone forever." Samantha watched the scene unfold, her own eyes brimming with tears. It was as though the weight of the entire day had lifted in that single moment. Seeing the joy on Jacob's face and the way Max responded to him left no doubt in her mind. This was where Lucky belonged. After a few moments, Jacob looked up at Samantha, his face a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "You have no idea what this means to me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Max, he belonged to my wife. She passed away 2 years ago, and he was the last piece of her I had left. When he ran away, I felt like I lost her all over again." Samantha's breath caught in her throat. She knelt beside them, reaching out to stroke Max's fur. "I didn't know," she said softly. "I just couldn't leave him there. He looked so helpless." Jacob nodded, his hand still clutching Max as though afraid to let go. "Thank you," he said, his voice breaking. "Thank you for saving him. I don't even know how to repay you." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick envelope. "I offered a reward for anyone who found him," he said, holding it out to her. "Please take this. You deserve it." Samantha shook her head, pushing the envelope back. "I didn't do it for the money," she said. "I just wanted to help." But Jacob was insistent. "You lost your job because of this, didn't you? I heard what happened at the diner. Please take it. You've given me back something I thought was lost forever. The least I can do is help you." Reluctantly, Samantha accepted the envelope, her fingers trembling. "Thank you," she said quietly. "But honestly, seeing you two back together, that's the real reward." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the park, Samantha felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. She had lost her job and faced humiliation, but in doing so, she had brought a family back together. And in that moment, she realized that sometimes the greatest acts of kindness come with unexpected rewards, not just in the form of money, but in the form of connections, gratitude, and a renewed sense of purpose. Her act of kindness had cost her more than she ever imagined, but it had also given her something priceless, the knowledge that even in the darkest moments, doing the right thing can light the way forward. The story didn't end there. Word of Samantha's act of kindness spread throughout the town. Former customers of the diner rallied behind her, condemning Mr. Edwards' actions. Many even stopped visiting the diner altogether. Meanwhile, Samantha used the reward money to pursue her dream of starting her own cafe, a place where kindness and compassion weren't just welcomed but celebrated. As for Max, he became a local celebrity. Jacob often brought him to Samantha's cafe, where customers adored his gentle nature. What started as a moment of heartbreak turned into a turning point that changed Samantha's life forever. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel for more incredible animal stories like this one.